I used to live in Tel Aviv, and one evening after a long day at work, I come back to my apartment. I was the only Arab in the whole building. I find that the door to my apartment was broken. I walk in slowly, cautiously, and inside I see that everything is destroyed: furniture overturned, clothes and paper scattered across the floor. My home, my only safe place, looked like a crime scene. I ran to my neighbor and asked him, "What has happened?" And he looked at me and he said, there had been a police operation. They were searching for illegal immigrants. I remember feeling furious and humiliated, not because of something I did, but because of who I am and where I live. I was so angry that I decided to file a complaint. So I armed myself with my Ashkenazi friend, and together we went to the station.
Let's do it. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Pluralist Podcast from both sides of the ocean. 2.5 weeks ago, I attended a mass protest in the heart of Tel Aviv, which was attended by tens of thousands of people, both Jews and Arabs. And it was a very moving moment for me, feeling the solidarity between the Jewish and the Arab population here in Israel, specifically on the issue of crime and violence within Arab cities and villages. We started this evening with a Havdalah ceremony that the Reform Movement conducted at what used to be Hostage Square up until not long ago, saying that we cannot stand idly by as we see so many people lose their lives, and while the government is not doing literally anything about this. So it was important for us to raise a strong voice against it and about the need to treat this phenomenon. And this is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about what is really happening in Arab villages, in Arab communities, and what would it take to reverse it, to stop this really terrible phenomenon.
I want to invite everyone into this really critical and important conversation about an issue that may be confusing and hard to understand and hard to internalize the multi-levels of complexity that it brings. But Lama Yassin's voice is someone who should be listened to and who you'll hear more of as an up-and-coming representative in the public sector dealing with some of the society. And I do want to just apologize that there may be some technical issues with the sound and some of the transmission, but stick with us because this is a very, very important conversation not to be missed. First of all, it warms my heart that you were out at this protest, and I'm looking forward to hearing from our guests. And I'll just say that from the perspective of those of us outside of Israel, especially in the United States, sometimes there is a bit of confusion and not, a deep understanding of this issue, even though many of us are well read and, keep up on current events and understand what's going on in Israel. But to say that just after the wars ended and now we're looking at this issue of violence in the Arab community or the Arab sector or the Palestinian Israeli community. And in a second, I'd love to hear from our guest about how she sees this. But there are big questions remaining in terms of what is the relationship between this community as a minority in Israel with the police and law enforcement? How do you deal with big questions of racism? How do we deal with, this kind of violence and how it should be either prevented, enforced, or how do we protect against these people? And so many, many questions. And really, what is the role of the government in terms of Arab society? And how do we feel about loyalty and all of these massive, massive questions that I think a lot of people are trying to sort out right now, which is why I'm so glad that we're doing this episode. And I think it will be really helpful for a lot of our listeners and viewers.
Yeah, for sure. And we are so honored to be joined today by Lama Yassin from the Abraham Initiatives. Lama is a public policy professional working across the public sector and civil society to build safer, more equitable, and genuinely shared communities. She serves as director of the Shared Cities and Shared Regions program and director of the Safe Communities program at the Abraham Initiatives, where she leads national and municipal policy efforts on shared society, local governance, and reducing violence in the Arab community through data-driven planning and cross-sector collaboration. Lama, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Orly. Hi, Orly and Josh.
And maybe we can begin with you telling us a little bit about ourselves and how you are sort of connected to the issue we're talking about today.
I used to live in Tel Aviv, and one evening after a long day at work, I come back to my apartment. An old, small apartment, old building. I was the only Arab in the whole building. And I climbed the stairs and I find that the door to my apartment was broken. I walk in slowly, cautiously, and inside I see that everything is destroyed. Furniture overturned, clothes and paper scattered across the floor. My home, my only safe place, looked like a crime scene. I ran to my neighbor and asked him, "What has happened?" And he looked at me and he said, there had been a police operation. They were searching for illegal immigrants and they had information that some might be hiding at your place. I remember feeling furious and humiliated, not because of something I did, but because of who I am and where I live. I was so angry that I decided to file a complaint. I knew, of course, that an Arab walking into a police station to complain about the police is not exactly a promising scenario. So I armed myself with my Ashkenazi friend, and together we went to the station. We were directed to the head of the department, and on his door there was this huge sticker that said in bold letters, "Less Arabs, less terror." That was the moment everything became clear. This is what over-policing looks like. Homes violated, racial profiling, collective suspicion, maximum force where there is no actual threat. And then there is the other side of the story. Organized crime in the Arab communities, protection fees, illegal weapons, murder, 252 victims in 2025 alone, the deadliest year for Arabs in Israel. And there, the system is absent. No urgency, no massive operation, no doors broken down, no overwhelming show of force. So, yes, the story is about policing, or precisely about under policing, about a system that knows exactly how to be violent and knows exactly when to look away.
Well, thank you, Lama, for sharing that really powerful story. I think it really exemplified so many of the multiple layers that we're looking at in terms of, feeling safe and secure as a citizen in the state of Israel, the question of over policing and under policing. But I want to ask you if you'd be willing to zoom out a little bit and paint for us the picture of life in Arab Israeli society, and even just help us understand what is the best terminology to use. Do you consider yourself an Arab Israeli, Palestinian Israeli? What's the best term should we use? And take us through the life, in terms of when we're looking at this sector of society, in terms of, it's 21% of Israeli society, really large villages and cities, especially in the north and some in the south. What's life like, and how should we understand this plague of violence that is now, going on for quite some time in the Arab sector of Israeli society?
I personally identify as a Palestinian citizen of Israel. I know that not all Arabs in Israel identify as so I do not try to represent all of them, but personally, when addressing me, I prefer a Palestinian citizen of Israel. And how it feels on the ground, where I always invite people when I'm talking about this issue to imagine a scale from 1 to 100 of personal safety, and like that they can maybe locate themselves alongside the scale. I don't know where you guys would locate yourself, Josh, as an American citizen, and Orly as someone who lives in a Jewish town, but I can assure you that all Arabs in Israel would mark themselves in the lowest end, regardless of where they live geographically, regardless whether they live in a big city in the south or in the north, or in a poor village in the northern border. It doesn't matter. Like, the feeling of unsafety is controlling all of our lives. You should know that we wake up every morning to a new notification of another murder, sometimes 3 murders per day. And it's very sad to say that, but it somehow became part of our routine. It doesn't feel exceptional anymore. We avoid leaving our homes after sunset. Like, whenever I'm in a public space, I'm eye scanning. and my body is tensed, expecting the worst to happen, fearing that I would be at the wrong place at the wrong time. Especially because most of the murders happen in public spaces, in restaurants, in clinics, in schools, in main streets, and nearly half of them take part during daylight. So public spaces are no longer public. They belong to the criminal organizations. They decide where we can go and when we can go. And they allow themselves to be very visible and very controlling because they know that there is no punishment. The crime solving rate in the Arabic sector in Israel for 2025 was less than 8%. For each 100 murder cases, only 8 are solved.
Lama, compared to like the general population, I mean, the solving crime rate is much higher.
If you are a Jewish citizen and you get killed, the chances of your crime being solved is about 60%.
60,
If you're an Arab
six,
citizen,
60. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. And if you're an Arab citizen, the ratio is about 20% on good years if the government is good, and 8% in the current government situation.
Well, I think it's really unbelievable. And I think a lot of people, Israelis, don't know how bad it is for Palestinian citizens of Israel. And I think a lot of our listeners who live outside of Israel, this is something that is unbelievable to hear about. But I think that a lot of people would say, well, it seems it's like an internal problem, right? Those are crime gangs that are operating within Arab cities. What does the state or the government has to do with it? And I think it is important to draw the deep factors that actually caused this problem in the first place and also caused it to be so huge in the last few years, including factors dealing with institutionalized racism and discrimination on many levels. So could you just give us some of those factors so our listeners would understand where does it come from?
The two main arguments I get from the Israeli public whenever I try to raise awareness about this topic is Arabs are violent, that's your culture. Islam is a religion of death and violence. And that's part of your DNA and identity, and that's why the killing happens. So, for that, I have two answers. The one is that if we look at the stats of the murder rate for Arabs in Israel prior to 2000, we see that the numbers were very, very low, even much lower than the Jewish population. After the 2000, something happened. Of course, I assume you guys know that in 2000 there was the October events where 13 Arabs in Israel were killed by the police, and this created a huge gap in trust between the police and the Arab society.
Would you give us a little bit more background on that for those that don't remember, like after the collapse of Oslo and what happened there exactly in October of 2000?
Was 5 years old when October 2000 happened, but I know it started because Ariel Sharon, who was the prime minister back then, at all these provocative acts in Al-Aqsa Mosque, and it resulted in riots and demonstrations and protests. And the Arab community in Israel went out to the streets demanding equality as equal citizens. And the police answered with such harsh and brutal way that they murdered 13 of the demonstrators. Two of them were from my hometown, Ala Nassar and Asil Asli. And Asil Asli was murdered wearing his t-shirt that said Seeds of Peace. He was an alumni of this program. But I think, like, even though I was not present in the protests, it created a collective trauma that was passed through generations, and it increased this mistrust with the police, or fearing the police, or seeing them as a potential threat or enemy. And it's the other way around. Also, the police sees Arabs as a potential threat or enemy. I wanted to say that against this argument that it's a cultural thing, you should know that it was not always like that. Prior to 2000, October 2000, murder rate were very, very low. And besides that, we did a comparison to the death rates in neighboring Arab countries. And we saw that the rate in Israel is higher. So,
Wow.
So it's clearly, obviously, not a
That's
cultural thing.
it's a very powerful statistic, actually, to say that.
It is, and if someone wants to check where that was, it's in our world data website. You can see that Israel has higher rates than Jordan, than the UAE, even than the Palestinian territories. So it's not culture, guys. It's policy, and this is what we're always trying to tell the public. And what are the causes behind this phenomenon? First of all, poverty is a central factor. Over 50% of Arabs living in Israel live below the poverty line, which means there is very persistent and deep economic vulnerability. And this next to land and housing crisis. Arabs in Israel make about 21% of the total population, yet we own only around 3.5% of the land. And you have to know that not even one single new Arab town has been established since the founding of the State of Israel. So these two conditions together, poverty on the one hand and the land shortage on the other, makes it or turns the Arab society in a deep crisis for resources.
Can you say another word about that? Because it's I just want people to grasp that. We have in Israel, at least, there are continued expansion of communities, right? Even a kibbutz builds an adjacent neighborhood, and what sometimes is the discussion around settlements, in Judea and Samaria or in the West Bank that say, well, it's just natural growth, right? So how do you understand that in even a big city like Shfaram or Nazareth or Sakhnin or something like that? What happens with natural growth as people grow up and have kids and want to have a house to live in, and what does that look like in those communities?
Well, first of all, crazy increase in the value of the land. Right now, any regular person cannot allow themselves to buy a piece of land. The prices are insane, and it resulted for many Arabs to leave their own hometowns, even big cities like Nazareth and the Shfamir, like you said, Shfar'am, are leaving to what used to be a Jewish city. If we look at Nofa Galil, for example, it was established as a Jewish town next to Nazareth, and now it has 40% Arabs in it, mainly because of that land shortage issue. They have nowhere to expand. Maybe the good aspect of it is that the segregation that the state imposed in the beginning is now breaking down. But the services given to Arabs in new mixed cities are not good enough. For example, in Nofa Galil, there are no Arabic-speaking schools or bilingual schools, and the parents have to send their kids to study in Nazareth.
And I know that one major factor is also, you said that the land is so expensive, so obviously people need loans and mortgages, but actually most Arabs can't take mortgages because the banks are not willing to give the mortgages because the land is not registered, right? Or is not sort of like the
True.
zoning is very different within Arab cities.
True. So a study that was published by the Bank of Israel about 2 years ago showed that the Arab sector accounts for only 2% of the mortgage borrowers, meaning that when Arabs try to get a loan to buy a piece of land or to build a house and they're not getting it from the legal authorities of the country or the legal banks, they turn into the black market. So if you don't have any access to institutional financing, you are forced to rely on alternative sources. The Arab citizens seeking to build or to purchase a home or a piece of land have almost no access to institutional financing and are forced to rely on alternative resources. And this is precisely where the criminal organizations step in. They offer loans and then they want high interest rates and informed repayment through intimidation and violence. And that's one of the main reasons why we have such high rates of youth who are murdered in the Arab society. More than 50% of the murder victims are youth between the ages 18 to 35. So exactly at the stage where they should be establishing their lives and building a career or chasing their dreams, we see like a whole generation is wiped out of the demographical.
Are there other factors like maybe a shift in the traditional structure of the Arab family? I mean, there used to be sort of people were more respectful or obedient to like their parents, and now it has sort of changed a little bit, and that may cause some people who sort of drift to the edges of society to find some kind of meaning in crime gangs or crime organizations because they don't have like any answer in like legal frameworks or institutions. Is that also like one fact, an additional factor in this regard?
Well, the process of globalization is happening everywhere. It's not happening only in the Arab community in Israel. So, of course, there is that you are more individual oriented and less collective oriented, less like family oriented. We do see that. And we do see that the sheikh, which is like the religious figure, respected figure in the Arab community, is kind of losing their power or their status. But I don't think this is the main reason for the rise in organized crime. I think, especially when we talk about youth, it's more the lack of resources, the lack of after school programs, the lack of the feeling of belonging to the community. If you are a young boy and you feel powerless and hopeless with no money, no education, no future, and this gang comes and offers you money and status and power, you develop a feeling of belonging, even though it's a bad one, it's a negative one. But for this young boy, it's like you have someone in your back.
Yeah.
I think you painted a really important picture of the systemic reasons that led to some of this organized crime and violence, leading to the housing crisis, affordability, all of those questions. But help me connect the dots to how the youth are becoming victims of this. And I think, taking what Orly said about, the dismantling of formal familial and societal structures.
So when we look at the organized crime, we're talking about a whole system that is built by a head of the criminal organization who has the power and who had been doing that for long enough, and he has all the resources that he needs. And then it's like a tree where people work for him, and he's not actually the one who's doing the dirty job, but they locate youth who are outside of the education system, outside of the labor market, who are more vulnerable to be attracted to this kind of thing. They give them a gun and they ask them to do the.
I
Yeah,
see.
but no,
I
but
see.
how come the victims are mostly youth? That was like the questions, right? I mean, obviously they're because they're more involved in the gangs, right?
Yeah, well, if you shoot someone and they want to take revenge, they would not take revenge from the head of the organization. It would be this little boy who needed so desperately to feel like they want to belong to a system, to something, and it's an easier target. Also, we have to remember that sometimes when the police is present, those who were on their way to commit the murder were caught by the police during police operation, and they would be killed in a police operation, and they're also added to the victim rate. In 2025, there were 12 victims who were shot by the police, compared to the year before where only one was shot by the police. And it makes us very cautious to say that it's good policing, because on the one hand, it means that the police is doing something, that they're on the ground, that they're trying to protect the Arab citizens. But on the other hand, we're very worried that this is like a trigger easy policy when talking about Arab citizens.
Can we get into the question of the police? I think because that, for many of us, I think, is at the heart of a lot of the question about what should be done about this. And I think you painted a really important picture stemming back to the events of October 2000, where the police killed in cold blood 13 Israeli citizens. Whether there's an inquiry or not. What is the relationship with the police? And I'll just give one anecdote. I've been watching the new show Yafa on Kan 11, and where one of the members of the police force who patrols the neighborhood comes from the Arab community in Yafa. And I'm wondering how that plays out here. I'm thinking of lots of parallels to American society, of course, but what is the relationship with the police? And how do you feel even when you see a police car coming nearby an Arab village or an Arab city? And then maybe we can get into the policy questions of what should be done and what do we want to have
Yeah,
happen.
and just before you answer, I want to mention to our listeners that, of course, the minister in charge of the police is the racist minister Itamar Ben-Gvir. He's in charge of the police, and so obviously it influences how the police is behaving around this phenomenon when we're talking about over-policing or under-policing. So, yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts.
It does. Like policy is really the biggest part of it. And I'm just going to mention very quickly that during the change government, we saw a decrease in the victims rate in the Arab community, even though they were doing that only for 1 year, but we could see the decrease because they actually cared, because the government actually cared to try and solve this
Yeah,
issue.
maybe just a few numbers, okay? That when we're talking about 2021, the number of victims was 126. Then 2022, it dropped to 116. And then in 2023, with this government, we reached 245. The next year, 230. And the last year, 2025, 152 murders. So
52.
just understanding the unbelievable numbers.
And already in 2026, we're seeing
Almost
many
one
so far?
murder a day, right?
Yeah, we have 51 victims since the beginning of this year, like less than 2 months.
Wow.
51 in about 6
Wow.
weeks. Yeah, yeah.
But to your question, Josh, that's also a question I always ask Jewish youth when I see them. Like, what happens in your body when you see a police or a police car? And it widely depends where they come from, that the answer changes, but they feel mainly a feeling of protection. They feel like someone is keeping them safe. And for me, when I see a police car or a police in their uniform, I'm freezed. I feel like I already did something wrong, but not exactly knowing what is it. And I would say that the general feeling among the Arab community in Israel is that when a police is there, they're probably there giving parking tickets, or like they're just showing off, or maybe using excessive power where it doesn't need to be used. And there had been incidents where Arabs actually tried to contact the police after serious events, and the police response were just ridiculous. They were just very unprofessional, that you would even question whether you should call them ever again.
And on the other hand, we see over-policing, right? I mean, we saw in the village of Tarabin in southern Israel, where people were accused of putting arson to Jewish cars in the nearby Jewish town. And so the police came and put blocks to prevent the Bedouins from leaving their town. So obviously that's like over-policing that would have never been done if we were talking about Arab victims. So it's like either not doing anything. Yeah.
And they did the same in Jisr al-Zara.
Yeah.
It was just less talked about because fortunately no one was killed there, in compared to Tarabin, where a man was shot dead in his head in front of his kids. Yeah, of course, over-policing and excessive power when not needed, when you're silenced. We also saw after October 7th that many Arabs were arrested for expressing themselves on social media. They were arrested blindfolded, took pictures of them with the Israeli flag behind their back as a sign of, I don't know, like why is it a bad thing? I don't know. So yeah, like keeping your mouth shut on the one hand, and then making you very, very scared of what they can do to you, but also knowing that they do not care enough if something happens to you. I'm going to share with you something from the last report that we did at the Abraham Initiatives. I interviewed 4 families of victims, and very sad stories, like a doctor who was killed while he worked in his clinic in daylight, or a 23 years old girl who was shot when she was walking around her town. Very, very sad stories, but what I want to mention here is that in 3 of the cases, the crime was not solved, so the murderer was not arrested. And when I asked each one of them, what is your relation to the police, only the one that the police managed to catch the murderer said, I trust the police. And what I'm trying to say here is that, like, it's not a very hard formula. If you solve more crimes, the trust will increase. Like, you cannot say the Arabs do not trust us and get the responsibility off your shoulders. You have to work for it. And the best way to work for it in such a crazy reality that we're facing right now is to try and solve the crimes.
And I know that people say that a lot of times people know who actually did it. I mean, like everyone knows, and the police says, "Oh, we don't know who did it," despite the fact that it's pretty easy to actually find out the murders. So it's like a lack of, they don't want to do it, not that they can't do it.
Of course. We saw in the past, Netanya used to be like the major hub for organized crime and
For Jewish organized crime.
Jewish organized crime, and the government knew how to fight it. Now Netanya is clean from organized crime. It's have a good quality of life, and like I'm thinking, if you could do it in Netanya, why can't you do it in Arabi? Why can't you do it?
And people feel safe walking around the streets, right? And
Netanya is a great city. It's a great city to live. It's a big city.
And could you tell us, but Lama, you mentioned briefly the previous government and how the numbers started to decrease, but could you maybe just give a sentence about what they did that started to solve this issue? And obviously everything reversed when this government came into power, but just to understand what they started to do?
Yeah. So first of all, funds were allocated to multi-year socioeconomic development plan 550. That's the number of the plan for Arab society. And there were 8. I'm on the wrong page. Lotova Dayan?
Lipsel.
Okay. So, Orly, to your question, the previous government adopted a more comprehensive and preventive approach to crime and violence, recognized the structural and civilian issue rather solely a policing problem, a multi-year government plans that invested tens of billions of shekels in Arab communities, including budgets to education, employment, housing, local government capacity and youth program. So areas that are directly linked to violence prevention. And there was an coordination inside the ministry together with community engagement and economic integration and informal education, employment pathways, local authority empowerment were expanded. You could see that they looked at the whole system, like as they saw that the problem needs a holistic approach and not only policing. When the change government was in charge, I used to work in a local authority, in an Arab local authority. And I remember that Sigalovich, who used to be the one responsible.
Can you say which one?
Reni.
Okay.
It's next to Nazareth, a small town, so not very important. Like it's not big. It's not very problematic, especially. But when
Sigalovich is the deputy minister of internal security who was in charge of actually dealing with violence in the Arab cities and villages.
And I think
from the Yeshatit party.
1 month after he got in his role, he came to visit our local authority and he asked to meet each and every worker in the municipality. It was the first time I saw someone in such a high position in the government who actually cares to meet us, like the workers in the public sector. Needless to say that with the current government, no local authorities have ever seen, and they don't want to see, I think, Itamar Ben-Gvir coming to their local authorities.
Yeah, of course. I wanted for you to maybe tell us a little bit more about what the Abraham Initiatives is doing around this issue. I mean, you mentioned the report, the really moving report that you published at the end of December. Other sort of platforms that you're working on to address this really troubling issue?
Yeah, so I'm going to say that the Abraham Initiatives is an organization that tries to change policy through action. Like that's our main goal. We want to change things from above, but sometimes the best way to change things from above is to show examples on the ground and then show it to the government and tell them, look, it's working. You should adopt that as well. In regards to the organized crime, we have a program called Safe Communities, and we mainly do research and monitor reports on crime and violence. We present them to the Knesset and to the decision makers in the government. We sometimes offer practical courses also to strengthen community responders and foster dialogue and safety issues. We had a huge program for that in the Negev to women. And youth. We also cultivate partnership among Arab locals authority, community leaders, and the Israeli police. There used to be times where we gave police training to raise awareness to the specific challenges of policing a minority population. And at some point, the police said, okay, we don't want your services anymore. But
And under the current government, right? Or even before.
I
Yeah.
think it was before. Yeah, but like it gives a feeling of the police being happy with who they are and not really wanting to change.
So let me ask you this. What would be your ideal situation in terms of police presence, in terms of solving organized crime? And I think, when we talked about Netanya, I'm thinking also about, different cities around the world. Every country has a mafia, and many cities in the world also have gang violence. I'm thinking about some of the inner cities in the United States that both have organized crime and street gangs of violence. And there are different communities who have approached this, some better, some worse. I'm thinking, some of us come from Chicago, where there was, really serious gang violence in the cities, where the police went in harmony with the local communities and the local institutions to really try to root out both top down and from the grassroots. And so, I want us to understand, what would you, or maybe, through the Abraham initiatives, what would be the best outcome or the best situation for both police and broader government involvement in the Arab sector in order to try and put an end to this and then prevent it from coming back? I realize it's a complicated question.
Complicated question, but a very simple answer. I think
Okay.
we should change the government. I think in the next election, everyone should go out and vote, especially the ones who do not vote in the Arab community, which are women and youth. We should go out and vote, change this racist government who does not care about anyone, honestly, but most importantly, not about the Arab society. And once this government is changed, we have lots of plans in the drawers to present it to the coming government who wants to see a change. And I believe that a good policy and cooperation with the organizations who work in the field and the leadership of the Arab community can actually bring the change.
And you think it's going to be like an issue on the upcoming elections, like later this year? You think that that could be something that could galvanize and mobilize more people within the Arab community to actually go and vote?
Absolutely. That and the racism from some of the people in the government. Yeah, absolutely.
So I have two questions on that. Do you think, without being political and endorsing specific parties, do you think that the Arab parties running for the Knesset, they've already spoken about coming together and doing a united list like they did some years ago? Do you see that as the best option for people, or would you recommend members of the Arab community voting for one of the Jewish or Zionist parties, in order to try and really make inroads and make change, and said, you now have to answer to your constituents, especially in this issue?
I think having an Arab representative in the Knesset in the Israeli parliament is very important. And I think voting two Arab parties, regardless if they do it as a joint list or as two parties together, or each one runs on their own, I think it's important to maintain this Arab voice, especially when it's being very much silenced during the current government. I saw yesterday that Limor Son Har-Melech, a Knesset member,
She's from Ben Gvir's party, from
from
Otzma
Ben Gvir's
Yehudit.
party.
Yeah, Otzma Yehudit.
סליחה. Do you like Yehudut Torah? Are they good?
Well, Yehudut Torah are Haredi, so that's like a whole different issue with its problem. So, but
They're good for their community. Not
Very
necessarily for
good.
ours.
they're not good for their community as well.
Probably not. Yes.
No.
Important. Yes.
I've read that they have like lots of cooperation with the Arab parties because they have like religious issues that are in common.
Yeah, that's a story for another
interesting.
episode, like the partnership between Haredi and Arab parties in the Knesset. It's fascinating, actually. Yeah.
Totally
Yeah.
fascinating. And remember, politics is a game of
Yeah.
interests.
Yeah.
And so, absolutely.
So, but Limor Son Har-Melech she's the chair of the healthcare committee in the Knesset, and she was calling the hospital managers and asking them to punish the Arabs who took part in a strike that happened around a week ago in demands of stopping the organized crime. Like, this is the the material in the current government.
Yeah, but let's talk about this strike, because I think what we should tell our listeners is that this phenomena has been going on for a long time, but finally in the last few weeks it has come to the attention to most Israelis, and it began with a strike that started in Sakhnin, in the northern city of Sakhnin. We actually went from the reform movement in Israel just a couple of weeks ago on a solidarity mission to meet the person who started the strike, right? Like a supermarket owner who decided that he's had enough. And once his supermarkets were targeted, and he said, I'm not going to give up to those gangs. And he started a strike that soon began a very, very general strike that really came to the attention to the mainstream Israeli media, I think really for the first time. So could you maybe talk about this current moment that's maybe signals some change, at least in the public awareness? And also, what do you think is the role of the Jewish population in Israel? I spoke about this solidarity and this amazing protest in Tel Aviv at the end of January. How do you think we could actually join forces to actually bring about change?
So, like you said, it really did start in Sakhnin from this business owner who said, I'm not willing to pay protection fees anymore. I'd rather die and not pay protection fees. And this led to this huge protest in Sakhnin where thousands of people came and very little Jewish population participated back then at the Sakhnin demonstration. And I remember that the initial plan, I was very involved in that protest. And the initial plan was to march through Sakhnin and then reach the police station in Misgav, which is a Jewish town. And when we started marching and we reached the border of Sakhnin and the nearby Jewish town, there was this huge police forces, like insane numbers of police forces who formed a human barrier, marking, like saying literally, your death, your problem, your protest, keep it in your Arab towns, do not cross to the Jewish towns. And for me personally, when we were together, Jewish and Arab people, able to bring this march and protest into the heart of Tel Aviv, it was like a saying. It was showing those who don't want us united, that we can do it together. And I think this actually marked a turning point in the common mutual struggle towards a civic issue. It's a civic issue. It's not a political one. It's about the right to live. And I think this was like a turning point back then. It raised awareness. It got relatively good new media coverage, even though the airing time was very minimal compared to the event. Okay, not surprising. And I think, okay, I'm going to be a bit pessimistic, but I think more needs to be done. It feels like after the protest in Tel Aviv, something calmed down a bit. And I do believe that Arab leadership needs to sit together with those who care from the Jewish leaderships. And there are some. I can even name a few. Should I name a few? There are some. Amal Azimi and Gilad Kariv and like many people from the Democratic Party are actually with us in this. And I'm not even talking about the civil society. There is a complete support. But like very main political figures are with us in this. They are always present in the Knesset whenever we bring up this issue, and they're completely supportive. And I know that there needs to be better work done to make this cooperation into something continuous and effective.
Yeah, so first we should mention, of course, that Gilad Kariv is the Reform Rabbi, and he really voices an amazing, clear voice on many.
We love him.
We love him too on many issues, including this one. But I want to say that I think continuing to keep this issue on the minds of Israelis and, of course, of decision makers is essential. And I want to tell you and our listeners that the Israeli Reform Movement and IRAC, we have decided to deal with this issue and talk about this issue during this whole year. And toward the International Day Against Racism, which is marked on March 21st, we are going to offer all of our congregations across Israel. We have 54 congregations to dedicate the week leading to this day to the issue of fighting racism and fighting violence in Arab cities and villages, to talk about this in Shabbat services, to invite different people from the Palestinian community within Israel to talk about this, because I think that the first thing is for people to hear about lives under this terrible phenomenon. and then to see what we can do to fight this, whether it's on a local level or on a national level. And of course, I'm saying it to you that we are, definitely your partners on this, and we see this as a major issue that should be addressed by, as you said, it's like common. It's a mutual interest, it's a mutual struggle, something that should be fought together, because this is, of course, something that we cannot accept. People are entitled to security, living in peace, and definitely not, accepting this reality as something that should be as it is. So, of course, we're looking forward to a political change, but even until then, we must not remain silent, but actually continue to raise the voice on these issues.
And that's sort of why I asked about the political parties in terms of, listening to who is a strong ally right now and is actively speaking out. What is their relationship? There always used to be a healthy sector of the Arab community in Israel who would vote for Meretz or for Labor, even Likud. Wanted to know how that's changing, but I think we covered it. In addition to that question, I'm wondering, Lama, if you have a message to Jews of the diaspora who care deeply about Israel, who care deeply about Israel as a Jewish and democratic society, and who even, when we read Israel's Declaration of Independence, and it says very, very clearly, the state of Israel will promote the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants. Hard to argue with that. And we can see that it might not get a high mark right now or a passing grade on that aspiration. So I'm wondering, what do you want to say to Jews who consider themselves Zionists or really care about Israel's democracy and care about Israel's image abroad when they're looking at this particular issue?
I want to say that I personally feel like it warms my heart to see Jewish people caring about something happening so far from their homes. I'm not Jewish, and to know that there are people who care about my safety because a minority that its rights has to be muftachim.
Protected.
Yeah. So as a minority that her rights has to be protected, it means a lot to me, especially with the current government and with sayings. Just this morning, Bezalel Smotrich said in a committee in the Knesset, well, it's Arabs killing Arabs. How are we responsible for that? And like you said, even though it's very, very bad for the PR of Israel and for the public image, it's also very inhuman. And I invite our listeners and the Jewish Americans to also see beyond the public image of Israel when thinking about this issue. It's an issue of life, of people. And I think to know mainly that it's not cultural, it's systematic, that if the government wants to solve it, it can. It has the tools, it has the power, they can do something about it. It's not our destiny to live in such fear. It's not my destiny to be afraid to leave my house after sunset. Like, it's a basic right of living. And
I think that's very clear and very powerful.
I want to show you my T-shirt.
Yeah, what does it say?
It says Arabs' lives matter.
Arabs' lives matter. You said before that you're pessimistic, but I do want to ask you, as we draw to the close of this episode, what does give you hope in this very, very challenging situation?
Honestly, the Jewish Palestinian or Jewish Arab partnership, I've been always a believer that for change we have to work together. Like the sane voices from both sides have to work together into creating a change. And the Bima protest, the Tel Aviv protest, gave me a much needed hope that I didn't have for such a long time. But yeah, partnership.
Would you be able to share with us on a personal note, what are your aspirations? It seems like you have a long career ahead of you. Do you see yourselves in the third sector, the public sector, or do you have any political aspirations yourself, of joining one of the political parties or?
Really liking the public sector so far. I've been with the Abraham Initiatives for a year and a half now, and I love it. It's like the most healthy working place I've ever been in my whole life. In my previous work, I was asked to use a different name at work because Lama means why in Hebrew, and that was a bit inconvenient for them. So here I feel I can be completely myself, and it's very healthy and good. I do have like this little dream of being more engaged in the political sector, political world, maybe Knesset one day.
Well, Lama, I want to tell you that you give me hope. You're really so inspiring and so brave. And we are so thankful for you for coming here and sharing your personal story and your professional work. That is so important. And I think what I take from this conversation is really definitely our responsibility to continue to talk about this and not stop until we can really, really bring about a real change. Josh, how about you? What are you taking from this conversation?
Well, I'm taking a really deep understanding of some of the systemic problems that we're seeing. And it's not just Arabs are killing Arabs, or to quote Abba Eban when he was asked about the Iran-Iraq war, when he said, "I wish them both luck." And no, that's terrible. And I think that you brought a level of inspiration about the cooperation that can happen between the Jewish and the Arab communities in Israel in order to cut this out and to prevent it from going forward. And I think you're inspiring, Lama, and I hope that we get to hear your voice more. And on a broad scene around the world, and not just in Israeli society. So thank you for being with
Thank you
us. And
so
this is
much
a
for
critically
having
important
me.
discussion.
Had a really good time, and I also learned so much from you guys. And like I said, you also give me hope, just even by the fact that you're interested to hear about this.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lama. And to you, our listeners, if you found this conversation meaningful, please share it. These are the kinds of discussions we need more of, honest, informed, and grounded in reality.